Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dursey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of APA and Chair of the New Urbanism Division, and I am your webcast moderator. Today is March 24th, and we will be hearing the presentation, Taxation, Zoning and Licensing for Short-Term Residential Rentals. For technical help during today's webcast, you can type your questions in the chat box found in the webcast toolbar to the right of your screen, or you can call the 1-800 number shown. For your content questions related to the presentation, you can type those in the questions box on the webinar toolbar, and we will answer those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. And I ask that you, when you're asking your question, that you please list who the question is for in particular. Okay, on your screen is a list of the sponsoring chapters and divisions. Thanks to all of the participating sponsors for making these webcasts possible and free to their members. If you're joining us today and you don't see your chapter or your division listed, we always urge you to return to your chapter or division and suggest that they become a member with us. Today's webcast in particular is sponsored by the Pennsylvania chapter, and you can learn more about this chapter by visiting planningpa.org, and you can learn about all of our divisions and chapters by just visiting planning.org. Coming up on your screen next is a list of our upcoming webcasts, and you can register for these webcasts by visiting our webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. And to log your CM credits for attending today's webcast, just head over to planning.org and log into your MyAPA account. And then under your CM log, you can search for activities by either entering the title of today's session or the event number, both of which can be found on our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. And this webcast has been approved for 1.5 CM credits for live viewing only. We do have some recorded webcasts that are available for distance education, and you can check those out at our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. And like us on Facebook, Planning Webcast Series, to receive up-to-date information on our sessions. And we are recording today's webcast, as always. It will be available on our YouTube channel. You can just search Planning Webcast on YouTube. And a PDF of the presentation will also be available at the end of the session on our webcast webpage. So with that, I'd like to introduce today's panelists. First, we're going to have, well, not in this order, but we have Elizabeth Baldwin, who is the Director of Development for the Department of Licenses and Inspections, overseeing construction and zoning, permitting, and licensing within the City of Philadelphia. Elizabeth's division processes over 50,000 permits, 125,000 licenses, and 25,000 plan reviews annually. She has served with the department for over 10 years with a primary focus on engineering services, plan review, and process management. Elizabeth holds a BS in civil engineering from Drexel University, and she is a Pennsylvania registered professional engineer and certified building code official. Marissa Waxman serves as First Deputy Revenue Commissioner for the City of Philadelphia. Ms. Waxman began her government career with Philadelphia City Controller's Office. Additionally, she held positions with the City of Philadelphia in the Office of Property Assessment and the Office of the Director of Finance. Ms. Waxman has also been a Senior Project Manager for the New York City Department of Finance, focusing on revenue collection and administration, and on staff at the Economy League of Greater Philadelphia, concentrating on government performance improvements, budget analyst, and civic engagement. Ms. Waxman holds a bachelor's degree and master's of city planning from the University of Pennsylvania. She is a member of APA, maintains accreditation with AICP, and is active in several civic and nonprofit organizations. Eleanor Sharp is a Deputy Executive Director of the Philadelphia City Planning Commission. She is a former member of the Zoning Code Commission, which worked to update the city's zoning code for the first time in 50 years, which was adopted in 2012. In her current role, she focuses on legislative and intergovernmental affairs for the Planning Commission. This entails working with City Council, city agencies, and civic and community organizations to implement the recommendations of Philadelphia 2035, the city's comprehensive plan, with a priority to remapping recommendations. This also means working closely with staff and council to introduce legislation mostly related to rezoning bills. Sharp has a bachelor's degree in architecture from Howard University and a master's in city planning from the University of Pennsylvania. Prior to arriving in Philadelphia for this position in June of 2013, she spent the previous 3 years as planning director for the city of New Rochelle, New York, and the previous 5 years as an associate director at the University of Pennsylvania Nutter Center for Community Partnerships. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our panelists to begin today's program.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Eleanor Sharp, and thank you all so much for tuning in. I'm going to give a brief overview of how we're going to unfold our presentation today. And I'm going to kick us off by discussing that we made this presentation originally at our APA State Conference, which was in Allentown, Pennsylvania, last October. We had a lot of interest and feedback about the presentation because a lot of cities are faced with a current challenge of how to regulate short-term residential housing. So we're going to first take a stab of what is the challenge or the trigger for us, meaning the city of Philadelphia and its agencies, that compelled us to get to a point where we needed to address this challenge in a meaningful manner. I want to emphasize that this is a case study based on Philadelphia and our experience, and that the lessons that we have learned or garnered from other cities we'll be sharing with you. Next, we'll take a look at where we were when this came about. What did we have on the books as regulations? What did we not have? Where were the gaps? How did we analyze how to move forward? While we were doing that simultaneously, we realized it was important that we should look to find best practices, because we recognized that, especially based on the feedback from our former presentation in Allentown, that this was an issue with challenges that a lot of municipalities were facing. So we wanted to get a handle on those who were ahead of us on the curve. What were they doing? What issues were similar to ours? How did they address it? What feedback they could give us? What lessons learned they had picked up, so that we weren't inventing this in a vacuum. We'll explain a bit about Philly's philosophy and why we took the approach that we did and what we did. And then we'll sort of wrap up with where we are today, now, and then we'll conclude with your questions. I want to state that one of the reasons you'll be hearing from 3 of us, and we'll be doing this interspersed, so I won't speak first, and then Marissa, and then Elizabeth. We'll be all over the presentation. And one of the reasons we'll be doing that is because each of us represents our different agencies, because we recognized at the time to successfully look at and tackle this challenge, we needed expertise and assistance from every relevant agency. Although license and inspection, city planning, and revenue are represented on this PowerPoint, we also had other folks at the table. We had the law department, we had city council, we had risk management, and I'm not sure if I'm forgetting anybody, but we made a concerted effort that this needed to be a collaborative approach, so that at the end of the day, when we're executing any principles or policies that we came up with, that they were well vetted and appropriate for the city of Philadelphia. For now, I'm going to turn it over to Marissa to discuss the challenge that we were facing at the time.
Thank you, Eleanor. So the question of what to do about these short-term residential rentals, which is what we're calling them in Philadelphia, but folks might be more familiar talking about specific companies that facilitate these, like your AirBnB or your HomeAway.com or VRBO. But we needed an umbrella term, and so we really used the phrase short-term residential rental to distinguish this, one, from just standard residential rentals, as well as sort of more traditional hotel transient lodging. So that's sort of the phrase that we'll use throughout this presentation. and occasionally we may slide into just using one of those company names as a placeholder or shorthand for when short-term residential rental begins to feel like a mouthful. So the challenge we faced in Philadelphia started when there was an announcement that the World Meeting of Families would be occurring in Philadelphia during the summer of 2015. And what that meant was that the Pope was coming to town. And we were very excited, we were very proud to be hosting this, and we were expecting a lot of people to come stay with us. And pretty early on, questions started to be asked about what exactly does this mean in terms of where are all of these folks going to stay. And obviously our hotels and our entire tourism industry, they were certainly up for the challenge and more than happy to put folks up and have them stay in their hotels. And we also had churches and synagogues and all sorts of other institutions also just willing to open their doors, letting folks camp out in basements and sleeping bags. But we also very early on started getting questions about how many folks would be using those short-term residential rentals, how many Airbnb visitors would there be. And it turned out that with the World Meeting of Families, there was actually a partnership between the World Meeting of Families organization and one of the short-term residential rental companies. And so that really began to beg the question of, what are these things? Do they already exist in Philadelphia? And then what does that mean if there's really going to be this institutional level support for this sort of activity? And we knew that even beyond the World Meeting of Families, that wasn't the only party this town can host. So the following summer, we knew we would be hosting the 2016 Democratic National Convention. And again, that would mean a whole bunch of folks in Philadelphia, probably more than our traditional hotels could accommodate and would accommodate. And we knew that folks would be looking for alternatives. And we began to get the questions, and maybe in your communities you have as well. And really, we knew that the tide wasn't going to stop. Right now we're going to be hosting the NFL draft, and again, tons of people coming to town. And those are just specific events, but we know that Philadelphia is a major tourism destination. So between folks coming here for our history, our restaurants, everything else, we knew these visitors weren't going to stop. And what also wasn't going to stop was the questions we started to get. And they came from a couple of different places. But number one was we started to get them from the press as people started to think about, what does it mean when all these people are coming to town? First, there was a buzz that people were going to cash in, that they were going to rent out their homes for $10,000 a night. And so, folks were beginning to post on some of these sites. And we would then get questions from the press. Are they allowed to do that? Is that okay? And we had to really, at that moment, think about, I don't know, is it? But what we did realize early on was that this activity was already occurring. So even though we hadn't really been, thinking about it and really regulating for it with you're going to hear about our building code, our licensing and permitting, our zoning, our tax code, we just hadn't really figured out how to apply our existing tax code to this situation. And so those press questions really began to get sort of our internal gears going. And at the same time, one of those short-term residential rental booking agents, which is another term that we use in Philadelphia, approached one of our council members. They were concerned that, in fact, our laws weren't quite so accommodating of their activity, and they didn't really like operating in the shadows, and they wanted the opportunity to become compliant. And we had some other folks who had questions as well. Our traditional hotel industry, this was a competitor, and they wanted to make sure there was a level playing field. So we decided that, we needed to figure out a way to begin to address these questions that were coming from the press, they were coming from the industry, and really they were coming from individual people as well, both from folks who wanted to rent out their properties as well as folks who were interested in coming to stay. They wanted to know what was okay, what wasn't. Were they going to get in trouble? So there was some confusion there. So we began to really develop an approach to meet this challenge so that we knew that we could continue to accommodate folks who were coming to the city. And so the things that we needed to make sure we were thinking about was, how were we meeting the needs of this emerging economy? This is sort of the sharing economy, something that really was not envisioned when our tax code came together, when our building code came together, or our zoning code. Philadelphia is an old, old historic city. So some of these documents and laws date back decades, if not hundreds of years. And so they weren't really built for the sharing economy. So we needed to figure out how to do that. And we then began to hear that there were some concerns about communities about what this might do just to the quality of life in their neighborhood. If all of a sudden a place that, you know, used to be the same families and friends that you saw day in, day out, all of a sudden new faces were coming through every day. You know, what kind of frictions might there be? And we needed to be really mindful of that. You know, we wanted to be really welcoming to all of these visitors, but never at the expense of the folks who live here. And so making sure that we preserved our neighborhood quality of life was really important. And then we really wanted to provide folks a path to compliance. I'm speaking from the tax perspective, and we love it when people do what they're supposed to do, when they pay us what they're supposed to pay us. And we really wanted to give the folks who are asking the question saying, is it okay if I rent out my house? Is it okay if I stay in a room like this? A path to be able to do the right thing. We didn't want to sort of keep this underground and a hidden activity. We wanted to make sure that folks had a way to do the right thing. And so that was really important for us. And again, that level playing field, as we were talking about, you know, our traditional hospitality industry, you know, they have to follow a number of rules. They have to pay a number of taxes. And we wanted to make sure that, you know, those major employers and economic generators weren't being undermined by some other activities in the city. So these were all of the things that we were thinking about as we were facing this challenge starting before the Pope showed up in 2015. I'm now going to turn it over to Betsy to talk about sort of where we were at that time.
Thank you, Marissa. I'm going to speak about this from the code enforcement perspective, and from code enforcement I'm addressing land use through the zoning code, construction requirements through the building code, and operation requirements necessary for the license. So in 2015, this use was still considered an emerging use for us, and it was not addressed by any of our codes. The typical approach that we would take in evaluating any use is we look at the activity and determine which of the predefined categories it would fit into. If we can't fit it into any category, then it's an automatic denial, and it can only be obtained through the Zoning Board of Adjustment, going through a lengthy appeals and variance process. So if we were to take a look at this in 2015, the closest fit would be two primary uses, single-family living and visitor accommodations. Now, visitor accommodations is typically a hotel or a motel. It's only permitted under the zoning code for properties at the city's core, which are really intended for large-scale multi-use development, primarily high-rises, and also some area shopping centers. If anyone is not familiar with Philadelphia, our center city area, which attracts the most visitors, it's very walkable. There's residential properties peppered throughout, and it's surrounded by residential neighborhoods. So these residential properties, which would be the prime candidates for Airbnb, would not be able to attain this use without a variance. So from a building code standpoint, we also had to determine what occupancy classification it fit into, because there's separate categories for transient and permanent occupancies. And this is significant because if it were to move into another category, a new certificate of occupancy would be required, and there'd be life safety improvements. Most of our housing stock would require a retrofit of a sprinkler system in order to meet the transient requirements of the building code. So at that time, we knew the activity was occurring, but we weren't really receiving any complaints. Up to that point, we didn't feel that it fit into our code. We didn't really know how to enforce it, so we turned a blind eye. However, with 2 million visitors expected for the World Meeting of Families, it became very important that we take action. There was also growing concern due to the widespread growth of these short-term rentals that it could spur into undesirable activity, primarily unlicensed rooming houses and also student housing. If not properly regulated, these uses can pose a threat to the integrity of the surrounding neighborhood and also pose a threat to the occupants themselves. It was clear that we had to bring this activity above ground in a way that made sense, but still discouraged more impactful uses. So there was a few challenges from the code enforcement perspective. From really a sort of a planning perspective, the fabric of the use had to remain residential. The neighbors could not feel threatened or less secure, and noise, trash, and parking issues had to be kept at bay. I think most importantly from the code enforcement perspective, We really needed to make sure that this could not morph into rooming houses or other uses. And again, from the building code perspective, we had to consider what would constitute a use group change under the building code. We also had to consider the safety of the occupants where there was no use group change. Just because maybe sprinklers aren't necessary doesn't mean that other life safety precautions wouldn't be necessary. Renters are at a greater risk because they're not familiar with the surroundings and they're not going to react as quickly in the event of an emergency. So they were things that we had to consider. I'm going to take it back to Eleanor.
So as we did this, and Revenue took the lead on this portion of contacting a number of these cities who we felt were already ahead of the curve on some of this work. This included San Francisco and Portland and Washington, D.C., because these cities had already enacted some form of legislation or had come to some agreement that they needed to address with regulation of these activities. So one of the takeaways from those conversations and review of the work that these other cities had done, their experience elsewhere that we've discovered, was that it was critical to know your own concerns because every city is different and has different dynamics, different structures, different housing typology. There's a whole variety of differences across the nation. And it was critical to know and understand so you could prioritize and address the specific concerns of your own community. For example, some cities had concerns about rental housing availability and to have restricted wanted to restrict short-term rentals to owner occupants. This would prevent non-owners from participating in the market, and that proved an important step in some cities in keeping the supply of rental market from dropping off. In Philadelphia, and we'll talk about this later when we discuss what we did, we actually did not prevent non-owners from participating in this market. We allowed renters to also participate as well as homeowners. Zoning compliance is a challenge. That's what a lot of the cities told us, that it's an uphill battle because most short-term rental operators, and we're talking about the big guys, the Airbnbs, the VRBOs, et cetera, those agencies, not the individual homeowner per se, are less than helpful when it comes to enforcing zoning code requirements on their hosts, as it seems to them a competitive disadvantage and thereby threatens their revenue. So as Marissa mentioned earlier, we wanted a path to an easier compliance of all participants in this industry. So there's some, as you can read on the screen, there's some salient takeaways that we garnered from some of those cities. But the key recommendations across the board that they mentioned was to legislate strongly, that we recommend reviewing codes, ensuring that they're up to date, and to ensure that they cover short-term rental activities. And this is where the collaborative efforts came in. The tax code, the zoning code, the building codes, any code that is relevant to these sort of activities, we had to check because this was an emerging economy which didn't neatly fit, as Betsy mentioned, into anything that we had on the books. Their suggestion was that strong legislation allowed for strong bargaining power, and most municipalities we spoke to cited this as the most important step, especially when it came to collecting tax revenue. Another key recommendation they stated was that it was important to start to talk to the operators as soon as possible, that the city may have been able to generate revenues without waiting for legislation, because to get legislation through the process, especially if there are any municipal colleagues on here, we know there's a time period for that. And what they suggested was that a lot of the operators wanted to be in compliance and were willing and eager to collect and remit the hotel taxes. So that's one suggestion or key takeaway that we got from them, that it was important not to just sit and just wait on legislation, but also to discuss with operators, how this can get jump-started. Melinda's going to take a stab right now at what her philosophy was at the time. Oh, sorry.
Well, so first, actually, I'm going to just show you this slide, which may be a lot of information to digest, but looking at San Francisco, Portland, D.C., and San Jose, just to give you a sense of the range of what they were dealing with in terms of tax rates, how they defined the maximum number of days where folks would stay, whether or not certain tax licenses or permits were required, whether there were any non-tax related permits, so building, zoning, whatnot, the choices they made around owner-occupants, and then what sort of fines and or other penalties there were for non-compliance. And I show this mainly just to show you that there really is a range out there. In San Francisco, everything was restricted to owned and occupied units. And then, you know, for any renters in certain places, they couldn't charge more than the rent that they were already paying. And, you know, talking to folks in San Francisco and reviewing exactly how their legislation was structured and everything they did, it was clear you could see that their unique challenge had to do with preserving access to affordable housing. That, you know, and everybody knows that San Francisco has some of the highest real estate values and rents in the nation, and that, you know, being able to supply workforce housing is increasingly a problem there. And Philadelphia, you know, has very different challenges. Some of our largest challenges are around poverty. Out of the 10 largest cities, unfortunately, we have the highest poverty rate. So on issues around, you know, how to make this available, actually, we were more interested in making sure that, say, renters could participate in this because we were sort of interested in this as an additional revenue stream for folks and an income for Philadelphians who are struggling to get by. And so, again, really understanding that framework of how you're coming at this is really important to then shaping what legislation or policies and procedures you ultimately come up with. I think one of the most important things we learned by looking at all these different cities was that we couldn't just copy and paste another city's legislation and regulation, that the context really mattered. And as a tax administrator and tax professional, I'll be honest, that's not always true. A lot of times it's very easy for me to just chit-chat with another city, see what they're doing, and, you know, just make a few tweaks here and there. This was a really unique opportunity and a unique need for us to really examine who we were. And so in a moment, I'll talk to you about that philosophy when we really had to define it ourselves. So our advice for anyone else doing this is that we'd really encourage you to sort of look deeply into yourselves as you're developing this. And another interesting thing was on the last slide, you saw San Francisco said, you know, don't wait for a holistic solution across city government. And there are certainly times when we know that's true. I'm sure anyone working in government knows that sometimes one part moves faster or slower than the others. But we did get really lucky in Philadelphia in this instance where we had not only all of the folks on the executive side working together, also our elected officials, our city council. We were working in tandem with them and across departments, and it's sort of why on this call today you've got folks from our Department of Licenses and Inspections, Revenue, and Planning. I'll be honest, we don't often all get together around one topic and sort of move the ball forward, so this has really been a great opportunity. I think in part for Philadelphia is because this grew out of, you know, an opportunity. We knew all of those companies were coming. We weren't facing a problem that this activity had generated that some places might. We really were looking at an opportunity. And I want to sort of tell you a quick story. When Eleanor and I gave a similar presentation at the Pennsylvania Planning Association meeting, we were really struck by how many smaller communities in Pennsylvania had an interest in this topic for incredibly different reasons. So the folks from State College, Pennsylvania, which is where Penn State is, they've actually, you know, they had challenges around the fact that, you know, they had alumni and students renting these short-term rentals during big football games and throwing parties and being a nuisance to their neighbors. And so that was really their challenge. We talked to another jurisdiction that had fracking or some sort of mining operation coming in, and they knew that it was an activity that was going to be very intense for a very small window of time, but with tons of people coming in. And their fear was that folks would maybe throw up some cheap motels or other transient housing that within 4 years would be sort of boarded up and vacant. And what they were really hoping to do was encourage this activity of the short-term residential rentals, one, so that they didn't have to have additional development that had no long-term purpose in their community, and 2, so that local members in their community could participate in sort of the economic activity that this fracking was bringing. So there really is a huge diversity of experiences with short-term residential rentals, and as a result, there's a lot of different things that you can think of when you're thinking about, your revenue side, how much revenue you're looking to get, the permits, just the process, just, how many hoops folks have to jump through and able to participate. So that really takes us to Philadelphia's philosophy. Here, we really believed that we had to make it simple for folks to comply. Maybe we just know our population. Maybe, we knew that we didn't so much have a problem yet, and we knew that if we made it too hard for folks to do the right thing, they'd do the wrong thing. And so we had looked at places that had, requirements for all sorts of upfront permits and licenses before anyone could even begin engaging in this type of activity. And we totally understood why that's the right choice for some communities, but for us, because there were already thousands of these already in our city. If you just, we went online and started looking and realized, oh my goodness, there's a ton out there, all under the radar. We didn't think that it would be particularly easy to get folks to sign up to do something that that wasn't going to work for us. So that's where we really had to match the reality of the activity that was already occurring. We couldn't pretend that this didn't already exist and that we were starting from scratch. And we couldn't pretend that folks who were already engaging in this activity had a huge appetite for, going through a lot of bureaucratic administrative steps to continue what they've already been doing, sort of unbothered by local government. But at the same time, we wanted to make sure that we were being sensitive to folks in our neighborhoods, because we did hear some concerns from folks, similar to what the folks in Penn State had said was, around schools and colleges, that maybe this might take some, create some uncomfortable situations. So we didn't want to sort of come down on this, though, and be a buzzkill. Philadelphia, we're an old city, but, Ben Franklin, he's quite the innovator, and we really retain that spirit. But sometimes we have to be sure that the rest of the world knows that we remain a place for innovation and advancement. And so, as these sharing economy businesses continue to expand and grow larger and larger and become global, we wanted to make sure that we were embracing that and not shutting it out of our community. So that's where we really saw that we had to walk a line there, balancing a whole bunch of different needs. One, how are we going to balance that emerging economy and showing that we embrace that, while at the same time being really thoughtful and sensitive to our traditional hospitality industry, the folks who had always been compliant with building codes and zoning codes and had been paying their taxes for years. We wanted to make sure that we were sensitive to their needs as well. We really wanted to make sure that, again, that we were keeping our neighborhoods great places not only to visit on occasion, but really places to live, and that easy path to compliance. On the tax side, we actually tend to look a lot at the field of behavioral economics or behavioral science, which is just a mashup of, economics and the rational, what people should do, the costs, the benefits, weighing them out, and psychology, which is how people actually behave in the real world. And we knew that even if we put in a system where, it's not that hard to get a permit, and if you don't get it, there's a big fine, economics would tell you, well, then everyone's going to get that permit. But psychology tells us, nah, a lot of these folks probably weren't. And we didn't want to set up a system where folks would be sort of destined to fail at becoming compliant. We wanted to help them be in the right position to do the right thing. So I'm going to turn it over to Eleanor to talk a bit about what folks should be thinking about as they're developing the structure for one of these.
And I'll do that by telling you what we thought about what Philadelphia considered. We had a lot of conversations, lots of meetings across the spectrum, various agencies, including City Council at the table representing our elected officials. And one of the, I would say, apart from all the stuff Marissa just mentioned, the driving force for us, and perhaps because Philadelphia is a city of neighborhoods, was to ensure that our neighborhoods was protected. And along those lines, we had to think of regulations or try and come up with them that at the end of the day welcomed visitors but simultaneously protected our neighborhoods. And in doing so, we considered, well, what is the time frame in which we think this is appropriate for a neighborhood. Is it occasional visitors once a month, or is it regular? How many nights per year would we say is appropriate for folks to rent a room out? Is it 365 days of the year? Is it half a year? Is it only 30 days? Those were the things we wrestled with. Do we allow homeowners only to do this? Do we allow renters? Do we allow people who are investors who just buy a piece of property just to solely rent out? How do we factor those things in? How do we determine where to land the needle on? Do we allow this everywhere in terms of geography? Do we restrict where it happens? Do we say only in our downtown core? Is it allowed in the far out suburban-like neighborhoods of our great city? Like, how do we determine where this happens? Do we deprive some people if we don't say it's everywhere? How do we make these decisions? Do we want to regulate it in terms of compliance? How much, we're government and the citizens love when we add additional regulations to it. Do we require additional license? Do we expect none? Do we use some license that we have that we can make apply? Where are those points of contact that you need to figure out how to actually regulate it? How do we enforce it? There are public safety requirements that need to be considered, as Betsy mentioned before. There are building code issues. If it's a transient use, then there are different requirements. You need sprinklers. A typical row home probably can't afford to put sprinklers in. So how do we ensure that the public safety is respected, and how do we make requirements for such? And then when it came to the collection of the taxes part, I'll let Marissa take that one.
Thanks, Eleanor. So yeah, one of the other things that you really have to think through is who exactly is supposed to be paying if there's a tax. So we refer to booking agents. Those are the folks like your Airbnbs, your VRBOs, but also could be anybody who's just facilitating these but isn't actually the owner or operator of the property. So you've got a question there. Is it that you want the booking agents to pay? Do you want the individual property owners to pay? Is it that the visitors are supposed to pay? And figuring out that will have a lot of impact on how you administer this tax, and obviously you have to do that within the context of your current legal structure. So I'll start by telling you what we did in terms of the tax. And I want to start out by saying that this activity had always been taxable in Philadelphia. It might not have been legal from a zoning perspective or a building perspective, code perspective, but the activity itself had always been taxable. And I always think about this as sort of like the Al Capone rule. You might all remember that Al Capone, wasn't ever caught as a result of all of his gangster activities, but it was because he didn't report the income to the IRS. And so, that comes up over and over again, that even when an activity is illegal, the income is taxable and the activity is taxable. So we started thinking of this from the revenue side of, we just wanted our money. We figured the only way we'd get it is if we got the zoning and the permitting and licensing folks on board and figured out a way for folks to, not wind up in trouble with them if they paid us. So what we had to do, though, was even though it was already taxable, our hotel tax code wasn't built for this at all. It really, it was built for what I always say, it was built for Marriott, not some guy named Mario renting out his spare bedroom. And so what we had to do there was figure out a way to amend and adjust our hotel tax to take into account that there are sometimes these booking agents, that they're not the operator of the place, but they're somebody who's facilitating that. And what we did was we created an option for booking agents to be the ones who file the taxes and make the payment. And the reason for that, we didn't want to just leave it to the operators, the Marios of the world renting out their spare bedroom, is that from a tax administration perspective, it is a pain to chase around individual owners who each, maybe owe $15, $22. That takes a lot of effort to do that for many, many individual operators for small dollars each. It is much easier from a tax administration perspective to have it be booking agents, just a handful of companies making fairly large payments and filing returns to us, less checks to process, less paper to process. So we really wanted to make it so that the booking agents were the ones that were paying us. But in Philadelphia, we had some unique challenges there. Some jurisdictions, Washington, D.C. is one of them, they were able to require that it be the booking agent, that Airbnb and VRBO, they must be the ones that file the tax return and make the payment. And how I wish that was true in Philadelphia, but because we had a couple years ago, we had engaged one of the online booking agents, Expedia, who hadn't been collecting the tax the way we thought they should. Unfortunately, that case didn't go the way that we wanted in court, and as a result, we were stuck in a position where we can't force the booking agents to be the ones that pay us, but we can allow them to. So that was really the legislative change we had to make to our tax code in Philadelphia, is that we had to allow those booking agents to do that. We'll talk a bit about where we are, but it's probably not a surprise that some folks were on board with that and some folks weren't. So some of the booking agents who aren't on board with filing and paying on behalf of all of the operators, the property owners, that means that those individual owners who use other booking agents who aren't paying for them are going to need to file with us directly. And again, we sort of went back to that core philosophy we had, where we wanted it to be easy, an easy path to compliance. And so when we looked at our existing hotel tax return system, it totally makes sense if you're a global or multinational corporation with a huge accounting and tax department. The forms weren't a heavy lift if you've got that. But again, if you're some guy with a spare bedroom or a couch that you let people stay on, it's probably a bit overwhelming. So one of the things we did was create an online portal that we wanted to actually be sort of as easy to use as some of the booking agents' websites for folks to register, file, and pay with us. Honestly, it wasn't that expensive to put up. And it was important also for us to show that since we were asking booking agents to voluntarily pay, we had to convince them that there was a mechanism for individuals who weren't using them to also pay, because it wasn't going to be fair if one company's like, all right, I'll pay on behalf of all my operators, but my competitor, he's not, and there's really no way that his operators are ever going to pay us. So the key changes was creating that option for booking agents to be the one to pay, and creating an online system for when it was individual operators, an easy breezy tax system, which is not something that is usually accomplished. So now Betsy is going to talk a bit about the changes we had to make with zoning and permitting.
Thanks, Marissa. So the greatest challenge was definitely adding a new definition for limited lodging to the zoning code. And we also had to figure out how to adapt our building code and our license structure to fit this use. So you can get a little bit creative in those areas. For the zoning code, this was brand new. Again, it didn't fit what was in there, and if we tried to make it fit, it would result in a refusal. So really, we were trying to establish a definition based on our goals, concerns, and the activity that was actually being conducted. And we primarily considered time. So the first parameter to consider was the length of stay. We kept the eligible length at 30 days, 30 consecutive days. The stays of more than 30 days tend to reflect the month-to-month leases utilized by rooming houses or full rental units, and that's exactly what we were trying to avoid. And 30 days is also the limit in the building code for transient stays. Once it exceeds 30 days, it's put into a different occupancy classification. So then we had to figure out the annual threshold. Airbnb actually indicated that 85% of Philadelphia clients rented all or a portion of their homes for up to 90 days. And this was really the activity that we were trying to target and to accommodate with ease. But we also had to establish a maximum tolerance. And it was determined that any dwelling being rented more than 180 days per year would have an adverse impact on the residential neighborhood. So it then becomes more of a commercial use and doesn't belong in the residential area. And the 180 days also had building permit implications. Again, we were trying to figure out how to apply the building code to these infrequent rentals. The building code does have language in there regarding temporary structures that we can creatively interpret to apply to temporary uses, or even consider this to be an accessory use. So we can allow this to happen without actually imposing additional code requirements on the property. So we were really establishing permitting and licensing requirements based on a 30, 90, and 180-day tier. And what we ended up with were two definitions of limited lodging in the zoning code. There was short-term, which was up to 90 days per year. That could be conducted by the resident or a non-resident. And then there's limited lodging home, which is 91 to 180 days a year, but that can only be conducted by the primary resident. There's a couple of unique components to this as well. Limited lodging is only permitted when it's arranged through a booking agent. And also, you cannot rent to more than 3 unrelated people at any time. And that's really just aligned with a long-standing definition in our zoning code of a family. So this slide here illustrates the continuum of regulation based on neighborhood impacts. If you move all the way to the left, this represents a primary resident renting a space. On the far left, there are rentals that total less than 90 days per year and have little impact on the surrounding neighborhood. This activity meets the definition of limited lodging short-term, and there are code requirements to be satisfied, but no permit or license is required. So as you move a little bit to the right, we address owners who rent 90 to 180 days per year. The activity does have potential to create disturbance and also morph into one of those illegal rooming houses that we're so afraid of. This meets the definition of limited lodging home and requires a zoning permit. We really wanted to require a permit for this use to give us the enforcement teeth that we need. So should the operation become unruly or morph into something else, we have a lot of power to either revoke the permit and seize the property. So if we move to the right side, this represents a rental by someone other than the primary resident. Again, if it's less than 91 days a year, a rental license is still required because somebody's renting it, but the impact's still not considered significant enough to require permitting. Anything more than 90 days is viewed as a commercial use, though. And that would require a zoning permit for visitor accommodations and a building permit for a change in occupancy. This slide basically just summarizes the license and permit requirements. Again, a primary resident can rent it out for up to 90 days with no rental license, zoning permit, or building permit. If we move to 91 to 180 days, still no rental license. You do need a zoning permit for limited lodging, but no building permit is required. Again, there are some conditions in the zoning code that relate to the physical space, but no permit is required. Once you move to more than 180 days, the primary use does become commercial in nature. A rental license is required. It's considered visitor accommodations under the zoning code, and you do need a building permit for a change in occupancy, as it now will become primarily a transient occupancy. Non-primary resident, again, up to 90 days, no rental or a rental license is required, but no zoning or building permit. More than 90 days, we consider that to be a commercial use, and the same applies.
So I'm just going to talk a little bit about what Betsy mentioned in terms of greater detail. Like, these were the standards for limited lodging that we actually amended and incorporated into our zoning code, and it really covers the importance of maintaining the fabric of the neighborhood. And the city of Philadelphia would allow residents to rent out their home or rent a room within their home for short-term rentals, and these, as Betsy mentioned, were referred to as limited lodging. And we actually prepared a code bulletin or a sheet which is on our website, which summarizes a lot of this for potential renters as well as homeowners or occupants of homes who were interested in renting a room or a portion of their property. So what are the requirements and limitations in terms of, or what are the standards for limited lodging? And the essential takeaway is that a dwelling unit, the primary reason for it is that it's somebody's home. It's for household living. It's already there, and the idea is that the people who are living in there, as long as they're not more than 3 persons who are unrelated, it's to maintain the fabric of the community. And if you so choose, you could rent a room or 2 in your home. And the qualifications were that a home may be used for short-term rentals as long as it had smoke alarms, which had to be installed throughout the home, in each bedroom, in the hall, on each floor of the home, that there were carbon monoxide alarms, which needs to be also installed in certain regulatory manners. Signs for lodging were prohibited on your home, so you couldn't have a neon sign flashing like, you know, room for rent over there. Those are not allowed. Short-term rentals may not result in physical changes to the home, so you couldn't then adjust your property to no longer look like a home by constructing, for example, a separate building entrance for the sole use of the renter. The homeowner or the property owner or the occupant also had to provide certain information to the renters, as renters are not allowed to have guests only between the hours of 8 a.m. or are allowed to have guests only between certain hours to stay away from the Penn State phenomenon of just wild parties all night long, and those hours were 8 a.m. to 12 a.m. Renters should be notified of trash and recycle collection to ensure that it conformed with the regular schedule of the neighborhood. And renters should be notified that excessive noise is prohibited, and there's a part in our code that actually addresses that, and that violators would be subject to fines and penalties. Renters also were to be provided with the owner's or their designee's contact information in case of any emergency and or complaints or condition or operation of conduct at the home, and the responsible person must have the authority to resolve such complaints. And so these were very critical that got the buy-in mostly from City Council that we could move forward with legislating this, because we were looking out for their constituents to ensure that their quality of life was not compromised. So where are we now? I'm going to turn it over to both Marissa and Betsy to wrap this up for us.
So this is Marissa, and I'm from the Department of Revenue. As I told you very early on, pretty much we were at the show me the money stage of figuring out how to accommodate short-term residential rentals in Philadelphia. We knew the activity was occurring. We were pretty sure we weren't seeing any significant revenue from it, and that's what we were hoping to address, and it definitely seems to be working. Philadelphia's hotel tax generates between $50 to $60 million a year, and since we've done this, we've actually seen an increase of 5% each year in our amount of revenues collected. And the revenue from those short-term rentals accounted for 23% of that growth in the first year and nearly half of it in the second. And one of the things I didn't mention earlier, but is important to know about, where does our hotel tax money go in Philadelphia? It actually is all dedicated back into supporting our hospitality and tourism industry. And so that's one of the reasons why it was so important to our hotel folks that, you know, everybody be on an equal playing field, because the investments that are made from those hotel tax revenues in to expand our convention center, to do all of our marketing, tourists, to conventioneers and such, you know, benefits not just the hotels, but also the Airbnb folks. And so to them, it was really only fair that everybody be chipping in to support that. And it definitely seems to be working. So from a tax perspective, being able to find a path to compliance and accommodating this use has clearly paid off in terms of revenue. We, you know, our investment to facilitate the payments was pretty minimal. It was around $30,000, and, you know, within a month we had recouped all of those costs. And so Betsy will tell you a bit about what else is happening or not happening.
So this seems to also be working from a code enforcement standpoint. The enforcement issues are really difficult to measure because we don't have a database of locations. And we've issued very few permits. So most of these locations are actually exempt from permitting, or we hope that they're exempt from permitting. However, we've gotten no complaints that I know of. Actually, in speaking with our inspection supervisors who are actually on the street, they weren't even really sure what this was because nobody complains about it. So that's a good thing. When the legislation was first passed, we did get a lot of questions, primarily from condo owners in Center City who were concerned about the activity, but they seem to be happy when we explain that they can actually just go to their condo association, and if they wish to restrict that on that property, they can legally do so, but it would be through private agreement and not through the Department of Licenses and Inspections. Now, in the interest of full disclosure, should we receive complaints, it will be very difficult to enforce for a couple of reasons. Complaints would be difficult to substantiate. We can't really initiate enforcement action just based on a neighbor's word. We would need to come up with some sort of concrete documentation on what's occurring, and that can be very difficult and time-consuming. And also, even if we were able to document that and take enforcement action, our enforcement process wouldn't really lend itself to behavioral issues. Our enforcement process is basically issue a notice of violation and demand compliance. Again, just like it would be hard to really determine what's happening at the location, it would be hard to assert that it hasn't ceased or that it's continued. So that could become really challenging. Code provisions relating to physical space are really easy to enforce. When they're behavioral, it's very difficult. I'll take it back to Marissa for their next step.
So we do have, on the hotel tax side, the tax compliance is going pretty well, but always we want to expand that. But one of the areas that we'll need to look at in the future is, now that we know that this activity is occurring and there's a revenue stream for folks, on the one hand, we certainly wanted to encourage folks to take advantage of that revenue stream, but as a tax collector, I also want to make sure they're paying taxes appropriately. So while we do know that we're getting more of the hotel tax as a result of this activity, individuals who are making money from this have to pay either our school income tax, which is an unearned income tax that we have here in Philadelphia, or if you're set up as a business, whether it's a partnership, a corporation, what have you, we want to make sure that we're seeing that income be reported as well. So we're continuing to do a lot of tax outreach and engagement to make sure folks are aware of both the hotel tax obligations as well as the income and business tax obligations. So we tell folks, we let them know when we're speaking to groups of tax professionals, when we're talking to folks in the tourism industry, and even just neighborhoods. And in addition to that outreach, though, we also make sure that we're doing data sharing with the IRS and the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, which similarly the year after Philadelphia figured out how to handle the taxation of this activity, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania got on board, and they're now following similar rules. So between data sharing and outreach, we're expecting that we'll continue to see improving tax revenue in the future. Becky will tell you about the future of permits and zoning.
Well, from an enforcement standpoint, we're really taking a wait-and-see approach. As I already noted, we've not identified any issues to date, and we have hosted 2 major events in the past 2 years. We have no inclination to create problems where they don't exist. However, we are keeping a close eye on it, and should issues arise, we'll figure out how to address them when they do.
Thank you so much for listening to us, and now we are open to questions and discussion. Our contact information is listed on the screen, so if you have particular follow-up for any or all of us, feel free to be in touch, and we're open for your questions.
Okay, great. Thank you, ladies. The questions are coming in, so I'm just going to kind of jump on in. Okay, first question. How do you contact an online rental outlet when a violation is occurring?
So I can say on the tax side, there aren't that many of them. So what we were able to do was get a list of legal counsel or the general counsel for a lot of those companies. We started with a list that we had gotten from some of the cities that came before us. We've been very generous with sharing that contact list forward with other cities and jurisdictions who are interested. So this is one of those good opportunities for cooperation, at least on the tax side. That's how we've done it.
We haven't heard about any violations.
We haven't had any violations, but we would probably work through revenue.
Okay. It was mentioned that Philadelphia has a high poverty rate. How did you consider the effect on the supply of affordable housing or the overall supply of rental units?
So obviously in Philadelphia, like most cities, affordable housing is a challenge and an issue, and making sure that that's true. But in terms of scale of the issue, Philadelphia is a large city with many diverse neighborhoods. When we initially did our analysis of where this was occurring, It was not widespread and just simply wasn't enough of an impact on our housing supply to be a concern the way it was when we talked to some other cities, that really was their issue. And so for us, while there are concerns generally about affordable housing, this didn't seem to have a major impact upon it. And we often talk here that affordable housing is a challenge, but oftentimes it has more to do with the income of Philadelphians rather than the price of the housing. We also have housing quality issues here, not so much housing affordability. And so while we were very sensitive to that, and that was something that we made sure we were talking to as we formulated how we were going to approach this, it became clear to us pretty early on that that wasn't actually our biggest pain point.
Yeah, allowing this to happen wasn't going to take affordable housing units off the marketplace in Philadelphia. And that's why it pays to know your community. That was not one of our issues that we were challenged with, and still not challenged with.
All right. What kind of auditing access did the booking agents provide the city?
Minimal. Let's go with none. And that's something we knew too from talking to, and actually we have not tried to audit them yet. Voluntary disclosure and reporting, we knew talking to other jurisdictions was going to be minimal, to say the least. That, obviously what we would want to get is a list from them of every single operator, the address, the income from each individual property. And, but we also knew, having talked to folks, that that was something they were not going to supply unless we did a full-blown audit. Up until this point, when we're deciding who we're going to target for audit and who not, and where we're going to sort of see the best return on investment, this hasn't been one of those areas yet, but I expect that if we do decide to audit these folks, they will comply. But it certainly, the voluntary reporting hasn't really gone so well.
Okay. Does the City of Philadelphia require notification to surrounding property owners of an approved zoning permit?
The zoning permit must be posted if obtained, but again, most of these have been exempt from permitting.
Okay. This one in particular is for Elizabeth. The what we did slide, what applies for stays between 30 and 90 days? I don't know if you can flip back to that slide.
That one. Yeah.
Between 30 and 90 days. Oh, it's the same. So if you're doing this for 1 day up to 90, these provisions apply. The 30-day threshold was related to consecutive dates. That's the only significance of 30 days.
That's when it's short-term is 31 nights or less than 31 nights. Anything longer than that is just normal renting, the way that, for a regular apartment.
Okay. Thank you. Next question, how many staff members administer this program for the City of Philadelphia?
Well, none, zero. This is, at least on the tax side, there's been really no extra lift for the tax portion other than initially building the website, which we contracted out. So there was a bit of cost and a little bit of project management time, but administratively the tax side hasn't been particularly onerous. That said, we haven't yet done audits or done things like that. So money's coming in and we're being pretty laid back about it.
So from the enforcement side, it's probably been even less work. It's just another code provision, another use in the zoning code, another occupancy in the building code. It hasn't resulted in any additional work for us, and we haven't needed to allocate any staff to the project.
Same from the Planning Commission, none.
Okay. Thank you. Next question. This one's good. How is parking addressed in the code for the short-term rentals? And I guess maybe if you could back up for a second. So for example, around Ohio State's campus, you have to get a special permit to even just park on a street. You have, special streets just for regular parking and then people who live there. I don't know if Philadelphia, if the area has anything like that. So if you could address that first, and then on top of that, if it is addressed how you deal with parking for the short-term rentals.
Okay, I'll take it. This is Eleanor. We don't have any special parking requirements in our city. Our on-street parking is enforced by the Philadelphia Parking Authority, which every resident, whether you're a visitor or you live there permanently, have to adhere to. There are a lot of residential streets which allow for residentially zoned permit parking, but if you live there, you can get a permit to park on that street continuously, or otherwise you just have to follow the parking signs. If you can park here for 2 hours or whatever is allowed by signage. But parking was not an issue when we were discussing this. So we haven't made any special attention towards addressing massive issues of parking from short-term rentals, because we don't anticipate any. When we were expecting the 2 million people, perhaps then that was discussed, how to bus people in and get people here and where the buses would park. But on a day-to-day, not an issue that we know of, at least not yet. What was the second part of the question?
The second part of the question was just how it's dealt in the code for short-term rentals.
It's not.
Yeah.
It just has to comply with any regular parking.
Okay. Do you hear of any special concerns from towns or villages, so smaller communities outside of a large area like Philadelphia?
So, you know, we had heard a little when we were in Allentown at the conference, and we were surprised. Basically, you know, a state conference in Pennsylvania and Philadelphia were the big city. And so I guess we were sort of surprised that there actually was as much Airbnb type short-term residential rental activity happening in these places. At the same time, you know, some of the smaller places, you know, the scale can really have a different impact. That, you know, 10 of them in Philadelphia would be absolutely unnoticeable in a much smaller community. 10 of them can change sort of the feel of a neighborhood. So I think that there's just sort of scale issues that might be different, but we were surprised that there was so much activity happening in smaller jurisdictions.
Okay, next question. How does the City of Philadelphia regulate or not regulate corporate housing, whereby the property or the unit is owned by a non-real estate related company which uses the property for temporary housing for visiting employees, prospective employees, contractors, etc.?
You mean like commercial? Like if it's a commercial residential property?
Let me reread it again.
Talking about an extended stay?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's more like extended stay.
Oh, okay. So extended stay would be regulated in the same manner as a full rental unit. It would be considered permanent as it would exceed 30 days. So it would be no different than the regulation of an apartment complex.
Okay. How do you track or enforce the number of nights and hours of lodgers? It would seem difficult to demonstrate a violation of the code when the activity is conducted inside of a residence. Homeowners could simply deny the activity.
That's correct, and that's why enforcement will be very difficult. We're thankful that we haven't received any complaints yet, but it will be nearly impossible to actually enforce. For instance, we would have to research to find documentation that they're advertising or they're renting more than so many days. As far as what's happening within the unit, it would have to be a renter who made that complaint to us and would have to allow us access to the home. So that would be extremely difficult to enforce.
Okay, next question. While developing policies and positions with respect to short-term rentals, was there any outreach or interaction with neighborhood organizations?
We worked through our city council offices, and that was really how we represented the voice of communities, which is fairly normal for us, particularly since, as we said, this didn't sort of stem from anything bubbling up out of the community in the first place. There wasn't a ready-made group to go to. So really our elected officials, particularly for for districts throughout the city. Those were how the administration then touched the community, and they were the ones bringing the community concerns to the table.
Yeah, they're the ones who kept our feet to the fire to ensure that whatever we had wouldn't be to the detriment of the neighborhoods and to the communities. But there wasn't, like Marissa said, a groundswell of complaints about this. This was to accommodate the opportunity that we saw coming down the pike through these huge events that were coming. It's still not a complaint-driven issue in Philadelphia.
Okay, thank you. I'm getting several questions about dark blocks. Have you discussed that at all, and have there been any issues with them?
We don't know
what dark blocks are.
What are dark blocks?
Okay, has this come? Have you heard of it before at all?
No.
Okay, so we had a session on this last year about like the cottage industry. And from my understanding, it varies between, place to place, but it's essentially the difference between you're only renting your house, and then there are periods of time where no one even lives in them because all you're doing is renting them in the summer months or during a specific time, and then it remains vacant for the rest of the time. And then obviously there's a ton of concerns with whole streets just being completely vacant for several months out of the year.
Not here. We're a very dense row house kind of city, so that hasn't come up. We didn't even know what it was, but just show you how much it has not come up here. But I'll let Betsy answer if she's heard. I don't know. I haven't heard anything.
No, we've not heard anything. And again, I think probably most of these rentals are occurring within our very dense center city area.
Yeah, and there really isn't a lot of seasonality to this. And also the way we set it up, if you are a commercial, a non-resident owner of the property, you can't do this more than 90 nights a year. So we sort of didn't create incentives for folks to make all their money during the summer and then not do it the rest of the year. Like it just isn't, you're not able to do that. So we didn't create economic incentives for that. And I think also, again, this is knowing your community. We don't have that same sort of seasonality. While we are very pleased with the growth in our tourism industry, it's not like we're a seaside vacation town that's empty in the winter. We're close to the Jersey Shore. I'm sure that they have very different issues around this, but that simply hasn't been one of ours. We're vibrant all the time.
Yeah, if somebody on a street or a block was doing that, or even 2 or 3 people, the rest of the block would be so. I can't picture an entire block in Philadelphia that would apply to at any time. It's just not set up that way.
Okay, and for those folks that did ask that question, I was just trying to look for it and I can't find it, but I know last year we had a webcast that covered essentially vacation units in vacation towns and that topic. So if you want to go over to our YouTube channel and just kind of filter through, I'm sure you'll be able to find it so you can take a look at that. Next question for Eleanor. Were there any changes necessary to parking regulations to accommodate the short-term rentals? I didn't see it noted in the zoning changes outlined. And I think
no, there weren't any because our parking standards are pretty strict already, and we didn't imagine the volume of short-term renters coming in would sort of necessitate any change to our parking regulations. So I don't even think we discussed it, Marissa. I don't remember.
Yeah, I think there was a little bit of concern, but I think our thinking was that actually visitors to Philadelphia are less likely to have a car than our residents.
We're a very walkable city.
People come here because we're walkable. They come here by train. They come here by plane. If you're staying in our downtown where most
you don't need a car.
You don't want a car.
Right.
So actually this probably alleviates parking concerns in neighborhoods that otherwise would have families, all with their, vehicles. But we're lucky to have fabulous mass transit in a walkable city, so that hasn't been a concern.
Okay. Does use of a room or house for rental cause any change in the assessed value of the home?
It wouldn't at this point. Where it would in the future is that basically the assessed values are based on sales of the properties, And so if for some reason eventually the market values of properties change, because not only is it a great neighborhood to live, but also you've got that extra income stream somewhere down the line, perhaps. But again, I think, for the scale of Philadelphia, we have over 500,000 residential properties within the city, and the number of them being used for this purpose is, well under 1%. So it really isn't going to have that sort of impact at this point or for a very, very long time.
Okay, thank you. And someone was able to find it for me. The webinar was on March 18, 2016. It's called The New Cottage Industry. Thank you, Michael. If we could go back to that one slide regarding the one that we went to before regarding the total days, we're still getting a lot of questions. People are still confused. I'm getting questions about a discrepancy between the 30 days, the 90 days. I think we need to
I'll give it a whirl.
Slide again.
I'll give it a whirl. So we divided the license and permitting process into two categories. Whether it was going to be your primary residence, meaning that you live here still and you're renting part of your property out, like you inhabit the same space as your guest would. We also then had the second category that you don't live there. So you have a property, you may rent that property out, or it may be your investment, whatever it is, you do not inhabit that property. In the bucket of this is your primary residence, if you choose to rent through any of these proprietors for any length of time for short-term rental from 1 to 90 days, you don't have to do anything. You don't have to get a license, a rental license. You don't have to go seek a zoning permit. You don't need a building permit. So up to 90 days, if you inhabit the same space, you live there, it's your primary residence, you're good. So if you only wanted to say, oh, I only want to rent for big events that come to Philadelphia. So I only did when the Pope came here, or I only did when the DNC was here, and I'm only going to do when the NFL draft is here. I just want big events because I think I can make big money. You're good, because chances are you're going to be renting whatever out for less than 90 days. If, however, you want a second source of income and you want to rent regularly up to between 91 and 180 days, you still are not required to get a rental license, but you now must get a zoning permit, because as Betsy mentioned, when you're going up to a half a year, the chances of having some impact on your community gets higher, and so we would like to have a sense of when, where, who these people are that are renting for that amount of time. You don't need a building permit. So the only thing you need between 90 to 180 days, if it's your primary residence, is a zoning permit. If it is your primary residence and you want to rent it every single day of the year, anytime above 180 days, you need everything. You need to go get a rental license, you need to go get a zoning permit, and you need to get a building permit, all of them.
And actually, let me jump in here, because then I think the confusion with the 30 days is that this is only in instances where each individual occurrence that you're renting it is less than 30 days, the revolving door. If you instead are just getting a roommate who's going to live with you the rest of the year and for many years to come, that's not what this all applies to. So that's where all of this is just about for somebody who each individual rental transaction is less than 30 days. Yeah.
Because the presumption is if you're doing 30 days or more, then consecutively, then you're moving into another category. Now, for the non-primary residents, you don't live there. Up to 90 days, the only thing you need is a rental license. You don't need a zoning permit and you don't need a building permit. More than 90 days, again, you need everything. So the trade-off was if you don't live there, you need to get everything if you're going to be renting out for more than 90 days, because the idea is if you do live there, there's some inherent controls built in that you will be responsible, and you would want to make sure that certain safety measures and certain rules are followed. If, however, you're not on site, chances of that oversight happening is lessened. Therefore, we cut it to 90 days. Right?
Great.
if there's still confusion, we can be in touch to explain how we came up with it.
Thank you. Nothing's popping up yet. Okay. We're going to go back to the one question about corporate housing. The person asking the question detailed a little more what he meant. So what he's saying is when a company owns a house or a condo unit and uses it exclusively to temporarily house visiting employees or prospective employers, contractors, how is that regulated?
Interesting.
That is interesting. So they have revolving tenants. So it's really the company's responsible, though. I mean, the company is taking responsibility. They're not leasing it, right? These
I
are
don't
just kind of
think
visitors.
it doesn't seem like it.
Okay. I'll have to, I think, look into that. It would either be just a regular rental unit or a visitor accommodation, depending on the circumstances. I don't have the answer to that offhand, though. So if whomever is looking for that information, if they could email me, Elizabeth Baldwin, I will get a response.
Great. Thank you. Next question. Oh, this is interesting. So have you noticed if more of the traditional hotels have responded either negatively or positively to this new concept of short-term rentals?
I would say, and this is Marissa, in my conversations with them, they are pleased that we created a path to compliance for this, because that had really been their concern before, was that, you know, everyone was playing by different rules and paying different, you know, some people were paying taxes and some weren't. So generally the feedback has been positive from the hotel industry. There have been, and that was from our local Greater Philadelphia Hotel Association, there have been larger national organizations that try and come in and lobby that we should, you know, make this entire activity illegal. They, you know, and you've seen this maybe in other cities where they just think that we should absolutely, you know, cut this out, not make it a potential competitor to the traditional hospitality industry. And so we've seen a little bit of that from outside, but most of the feedback I've gotten from actual operators within the city is that, you know, they're pleased that there's this even playing field and that everyone's playing by the same rules now.
Thank you. A few quick zoning questions in particular. Is short-term rentals, are they permitted now in all zoning districts or specific districts?
They're permitted where a dwelling unit is permitted. So it's actually accessory to a dwelling unit. So for instance, if you're in an industrial district and residential is not permitted, short-term rental would not be permitted either.
Okay. And when a zoning permit is not required, do the zoning standards still apply?
Yes. So in the code, it provides a definition of the limited lodging short-term with all of the conditions, but states that you don't need a permit. You're still required to comply with all the conditions of the code, but we are waiving the permit requirement.
All right, thank you. Next one, has the Commonwealth legislature taken up this issue of short-term rentals? And if so, are they permissive to cities regulating them?
So I can tell you on the tax side, because the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania also collects a hotel tax, they have amended their legislation and created a process for this activity to pay the tax. I'm unaware of anything that they've done on the sort of regulatory side with zoning or permitting, but on the tax side, they've certainly hopped on board with this and got to the point where some of those booking agents are now directly paying the Commonwealth as well as the city of Philadelphia.
So the entire state of Pennsylvania is required to comply with the Pennsylvania Uniform Construction Code. So essentially we have a central building code, and there's been no changes to the Uniform Construction Code to address short-term rentals, so we are still at liberty to make interpretations as we see fit.
Okay, thank you. How involved was the city's economic development agency in developing these regulations?
We definitely brought them into the conversation. As we were talking about, this was like probably the Best collaborative thing ever.
And in my role from the Planning Commission, I also, like, my boss was the head of the Deputy Mayor for Economic Development, so he was apprised and abreast of all of this as well. So it wasn't in a vacuum.
Okay, next question, and then I think we're probably going to start to wrap up here. We are a community that hosts many popular events, and we also have several universities and campuses. How do you define adverse impact for neighborhoods? Our experience is vocal objection to short-term rentals in neighborhoods during these types of events. The neighbors don't like the transitory nature of the activity. How have you dealt with this?
I think we really talked about the behaviors we didn't want to see, and they were in the standards. I mean, so I'm on the tax side, so I really didn't think of it from the zoning side, but we talked about trash being set out improperly or it being too noisy, and those were the things we then tried to address, not just generally thinking the activity is bad, but really what were potentially negative behaviors that we wanted to make sure didn't happen.
And we have a lot of universities and a lot of big events as well, and I'm not sure why we haven't sort of gotten that same behavioral issues of the transient population here. So if we did, we would hear about it, because our population is also very vocal, especially about things that impact them adversely in their neighborhood. They want to walk through and not see drunken people or trash or noise or not being able to sleep. So all of those are similarly concerned, but we just haven't had that level of that reaction yet. Maybe we just haven't hosted the big event yet that will trigger all of that, but we just haven't had it. And that's why the standards were developed to say, hey, this is how, if you're going to do this, and this is the required behavior. But as Betsy says, enforcement of that, when and if it becomes an issue, will be another challenge that we'll have to address. We'll cross that bridge when we get there.
Okay, well, when you do cross that bridge and you have that really big event and you start auditing sites, a lot of folks are asking, as well as myself, that we want you to come back and talk to us about some of the issues that you're encountering and how you're dealing with the hiccups that are, I'm sure, bound to happen. So please keep us in the back of your mind when everything starts to get crazy. Come back and talk to us about it.
Awesome. Thank you for having us.
Of course. So Elizabeth Baldwin, Marissa Waxman, and Eleanor Sharp from Philadelphia, thank you so much for joining us today. This was very useful. And again, everyone just go to ohioplanning.org/planningwebcasts for any kind of CM questions that you might have about this. You can get a PDF copy of it. Head over to YouTube to view the recording of this. And we will talk to everyone next time. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for the Pennsylvania chapter for hosting today's event. Have a good weekend, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.